We welcome you back to this channel. Today, we'll explore experiences with secret rooms in old houses. There are some doors that should never be opened, because they will let out secrets that no one should find. Go ahead, turn off the lights, and let's take one more step into the world of the unknown.
Secret in the attic.
I moved into my grandparents' old house without thinking too much about it. It was in an isolated area on the outskirts of a small town. It was one of those Victorian houses I had always dreamed of living in. High ceilings, creaky wooden floors, and windows that seemed to have witnessed centuries of secrets. On the day of the move, everything went smoothly. The silence of the house, interrupted only by the sound of my footsteps, was comforting. At least, that's how it seemed at first. As the days went by, I noticed that the atmosphere grew increasingly heavy, as if there was a presence in the house watching me from the shadows. But I ignored it, chalking it up to the stress of adapting to a new place. One rainy afternoon, while exploring the attic looking for some extra space to store my things, I found something strange. A section of the wall seemed out of place, as if someone had tried to hide something. Without thinking twice, I pushed the wall, and it gave way, revealing a small door hidden in plain sight. The door was made of wood, and oddly, it had what appeared to be scratch marks on it. I opened the door. A rancid, damp smell hit me immediately. The room was small, barely bigger than a closet, and filled with old objects. However, the most unsettling thing wasn't the contents, but the feeling that this room wasn't supposed to be there, as if it were a space that time had intentionally forgotten. That night, I started to hear noises. At first, they were whispers, barely audible, coming from everywhere and nowhere. It was as if someone was speaking right next to my ear, unintelligible words filled with anguish. I tried to sleep, but every time I closed my eyes, I felt someone near me, like a shadow sliding across the ceiling and slowly moving towards my bed. But when I turned on the light, there was nothing there. Still, the feeling of being watched lingered. The days were terrible. Things in the house began to move on their own. Furniture shifted places, and the lights flickered without any apparent reason. One day, while I was in the living room trying to work, I heard a creak coming from the attic. It was a slow, constant sound, like something heavy was dragging across the floor. I went up with a flashlight, determined to find out what was causing the noise. And when I arrived, I noticed the secret door was slightly open. I approached cautiously, and when I pointed the flashlight into the room, I saw something that paralyzed me. A dark figure, a deformed and twisted silhouette was inside, watching me with bright, empty eyes. I stepped back, slammed the small door shut, piled some boxes against it, and hurried downstairs. That night was the worst of all. I lay down on my bed, unable to stop thinking about what I had seen. As I tried to sleep, I felt that presence more intensely than ever. I tried to move, but I couldn't. Suddenly, I could see that creature from the attic at the foot of my bed. I saw it more clearly. It was tall and thin, with long, deformed limbs. Its face revealed a pair of white eyes that radiated an almost palpable malice. It started to approach slowly, extending one of its arms, which ended in long, claw-like fingers, reaching out to grab me. I don't know how, but in a final effort of will, I managed to scream and get up. I ran out of the room, slamming the door behind me. I couldn't stay in that place any longer. However, when I tried to leave the house, I discovered that all the doors were locked, as if something had blocked them from the other side. Panic took over as I pounded and pulled at the handles, but it was all in vain. Suddenly, the whispers became constant, like hundreds of voices speaking at once. The figure reappeared, sliding across the ceiling and walls, getting closer and closer. This time I didn't try to run. I knew there was no escape. But just when the shadow was about to touch me, all the lights went out and the silence was absolute. I woke up on the floor the next day, exhausted and terrified. There were no signs of the figure or the noises. I managed to leave the house, abandoning all my belongings. But the feeling of being watched never went away. I never knew what that thing was or why it was trapped in that room. but one thing was clear. That house held secrets that were never meant to be discovered.
The hidden door.
When I was 9 years old, I spent some time at my Aunt Helen's house. It was an old, enormous, and ancient house that had belonged to the family for generations. It was located in a remote town, surrounded by tall, lush trees. That house had always given me chills. The high ceilings and dark rooms seemed to hide secrets. Helen lived alone and was a quiet woman. She spent most of her time in the kitchen or in the backyard, tending to her plants. One rainy afternoon, while my aunt was taking a nap, I decided to explore the house. I walked through the hallways filled with old portraits, most of them of people whose names and lives had been lost to time. The floor creaked under my feet with each step, and as I walked further, the air grew colder. I reached the end of a hallway I rarely visited. It was filled with old furniture and unused items. When I got there, I saw something strange. A small wooden door between two dusty display cabinets. It was small and locked with an old rusty padlock. My childish curiosity led me to find a way to open it, and after a few minutes of struggling with a screwdriver, I managed to do it. The door opened with a sharp creak, revealing a narrow staircase that descended into darkness. Something inside me told me not to go down, but my curiosity was stronger. I went down cautiously, and the air became denser and more humid, with a musty smell that made me cough. At the bottom of the stairs, I found myself in a small windowless room, barely lit by a flickering bulb hanging from the ceiling. The walls were covered in worn wallpaper with childish patterns, and in one corner was an old wooden chest, next to which was a small bed. On the floor, I saw old toys scattered about, a ball, a rusty tin train, and a stuffed bear. What caught my attention the most was a blurred figure sitting on the edge of the bed. It looked like a child, but his skin was pale and translucent, as if covered in a layer of dust. His eyes were dark and expressionless. His hair was dark, and he was dressed as if he belonged to another era. I felt an intense cold and a paralyzing fear as I realized that what I was seeing was not an ordinary child. It was a specter trapped in time. Without saying a word, the boy slowly stood up and stared at me. I felt his gaze like a weight on me, an oppressive sensation that made me step back toward the stairs. I ran up and slammed the door shut, leaving the room behind. But that was only the beginning. That same night, as I tried to sleep, I heard a soft sound, like something scratching the wall. At first, I ignored it, but the noises became more persistent. It was as if something was trying to get in. I was very scared, but then I saw it. In a corner of the room was the same boy I had seen in the secret room. His form was barely visible, but his dark eyes shone in the darkness. He didn't move. He just stared at me. I was terrified, but just as he appeared, he vanished into the darkness. From that night on, the strange events intensified. The lights flickered for no reason. The toys I had left in the living room would appear scattered around the house, and I constantly felt a presence around me. Sometimes I saw the boy standing in the corners, other times in the hallways, always with that empty, piercing gaze. My aunt didn't seem to notice anything. She just said the house was old and the noises were normal. One early morning, I woke up startled by the sound of a child crying. It was a faint, distant sound, but filled with sadness. I followed the sound to the hallway, and to my horror, I saw that the small door was wide open. The crying was coming from down there. I approached, and as I peered down, I saw the boy at the bottom of the stairs, crying with his head between his knees. Suddenly, he looked up and stared directly at me. I screamed, slammed the door shut, and ran back to my room. I couldn't sleep again. That was my last night in that house. The next morning, my parents came to pick me up. I never told them what I had seen. Years later, I found out that on the day I left, my aunt had found the walls covered in childish drawings, scribbled in white chalk. I knew it had been that boy, but when they told me, I said nothing. I don't know how or why he was trapped in that secret room, and I don't want to find out.
The dark hideaway.
During my teenage years, I lived in a small town on the outskirts of a city, surrounded by a small forest. The afternoons were dull, and there wasn't much to do. Back then, my friend Luke and I were inseparable, always looking for adventures to kill the boredom. That day, as we wandered aimlessly, we ended up in front of the old mansion that everyone said was cursed. No one really knew what had happened there, but the stories ranged from satanic rituals to ghostly apparitions. To us, they were nothing more than exaggerated rumors. Luke had the idea to go inside, convinced it would be something interesting and different. I hesitated for a moment, but the desire to prove I wasn't scared won out. We jumped the rusty gate and headed toward the main door, which looked so old it seemed no one had been there in a long time. We entered, and a dense, heavy air immediately surrounded us, filled with dust and something else, something that smelled like confinement and decay. The inside was a mess. Furniture covered in sheets, fallen paintings, and windows broken by time. As we explored, we found a narrow hallway with a built-in closet. Luke, ever the curious one, began tapping the walls until he noticed one of them sounded hollow. Excited, he pulled on a loose board, revealing a hidden door. When we opened it, it made a deafening creak and we found a staircase leading down to what seemed to be a secret basement. We descended, our flashlights lighting the way, feeling the air grow colder with each step. When we reached the bottom, we found ourselves in a room that felt like it didn't belong there, as if it were from another time. The stone walls were covered in strange symbols and ancient-looking drawings. In the center of the room stood a figure, turned away from us. At first, I thought it was a mannequin, but something about its hunched, rigid posture made me feel it was alive in some way. It was tall, with a thin body wrapped in a black cloak that reached the floor. The skin that peeked out was grayish and looked rough. Luke, driven by his endless curiosity, got closer than he should have. That's when the thing moved. The figure turned slowly, and its face was revealed. It didn't look human. Its eyes were deep, black hollows, as if its soul had been ripped out and its mouth was open, showing a row of sharp, jagged teeth that jutted out like thorns. There was no expression, just a terrifying emptiness that seemed to swallow what little light was in the room. Luke stumbled back, tripping over a chair, and the sound echoed loudly. He froze, unable to take his eyes off the entity that advanced toward him with jerky movements, as if its joints were broken. I couldn't move either, as if fear had pinned me to the floor. An intense cold ran down my spine, and a strange whisper began to resonate in my head, an incomprehensible language, like voices mixed and screaming inside me. Suddenly, the figure extended a hand toward a corner of the room. Out of nowhere, from that dark corner, another figure emerged, just as terrifying as the first. Luke started to scream, his cries were loud, and he began to hyperventilate. The thing raised its head and its empty eyes locked onto mine. I felt as if I couldn't breathe. I don't know where I found the strength to run, but I did. As I dashed toward the stairs, I managed to get Luke to follow me, and we bolted out, slamming the door shut behind us. Once outside in the garden, Luke and I looked at each other. We were shaking. Neither of us said a word, but we both knew we had seen something that was not of this world. We never talked about what happened that day, not with each other or anyone else. Luke changed. He became quiet and reserved, and slowly we drifted apart. As for me, I haven't been able to stop thinking about that basement and those figures that were not of this world. Sometimes I wake up suddenly, feeling like someone is watching me, even though there's no one around. I don't think I'll ever get over that experience. Something tells me that figure is lurking nearby, waiting for the moment to reappear.
Thank you for journeying with us through the dark passages of these stories. If you enjoyed them, give us a like, share, and subscribe so you don't miss more tales of terror. Until next time, where fear will once again be your companion.